I knew I had to do something pumpkin for this fall, but I've done so many pumpkin things before. Pumpkin cake, I've done pumpkin pie flavors, I've done, oh my goodness, so many different renditions, but I decided to combine everything into one large macaron and make a pumpkin spice cake inside a pumpkin pie looking macaron shell. So let's jump into this pumpkin cake here. I'm just starting with some all-purpose flour. I've got some baking soda, a ton of cinnamon, and then I added some other spices like nutmeg, cloves, ginger, but honestly you can throw in whatever spices you want. You absolutely could just use a pumpkin pie spice for all of this if you really wanted to. Then I've got my eggs and sugar in my KitchenAid here. I'm going to whip that up pretty intensely until it gets really light and fluffy, more of like a ribbon stage. It's probably tripled in volume. And then I'm going to start streaming in some oil and a little bit of vanilla paste. You obviously could use vanilla extract or even leave that out since the spices and pumpkin are a really dominant flavor. Now, I made the full batch that I have in the description box. I have that recipe down there for you. I wanted to have some extra so I could make some other little cakes for my family and friends. But if you are purely using this for macarons, you could absolutely do a half of this recipe or even a fourth of this recipe, depending on how many macarons you are making, and still have a really good result. You might just want to change what kind of pan you are using to bake in, but just know that this is actually quite a lot of cake that you might want to have extra of, or you might want to adjust that for your own needs. I am adding in all of the pumpkin and then the dry ingredients, and by the time I get to the dry ingredients, as you can see here, I switched from my whisk attachment to the paddle attachment, just because whenever you have a dry ingredient like flour to incorporate, you really don't want to over mix that. So I'm adding it in just a couple additions so I don't get weird clumps or pockets of things, and then I am just going to mix it only until it's barely incorporated. Then I'm gonna stop, transfer it to my pan, and bake it. So I wanted a relatively thick cake here for my pumpkin cake especially because I'm using a large format for my macarons. My macaron shell is going to be about 5 or 6 inches. So I'm pouring most of this into like a 9 by 13 pan. And then I have a little bit that I'm pouring into a 6-inch round. But depending again on if you're making mini macs with this same flavor and recipe, if you are making even large, if you have an 8-inch mac cake that you're making, if you want a really thin layer of cake, or if you just want to use this cake recipe, you absolutely could just pour this into 6-inch or 8-inch rounds and make a really lovely cake with this cake recipe and the buttercream recipe I'm going to give you. I'm just going to pop this into my oven and give this a good bake. And while that is baking, I'm going to start in on my macaron shells. As I mentioned, I am making some pretty large macaron shells, but other than the size, nothing is going to be different. I have all my same regular tools, same ingredients. I've got room temperature egg whites, sugar with some cream of tartar, almond flour and powdered sugar. I've got some templates here that I made. I am using quite a large piping tip. And then I have, pumpkin powdered color from the Sugar Art. You could use a gel color, of course, if you want to. Obviously, since this is supposed to look like a pumpkin pie, I think going in an orange direction is probably the best. Because this is a French meringue, I'm starting off with my room temperature egg whites, whipping those until they look white and frothy, then starting to slowly stream in my sugar and cream of tartar. Once all of that is incorporated and once it's about 70% done, I've reached like a medium soft peak. That is when I'm going to add in my food colorant, whether it is a gel or a powder. That is the perfect time to add that in. I love this pumpkin color. I think it is really true to the name. It is a really vibrant orange. If you wanted this to be a little bit lighter or darker, you obviously could add some brown or a touch of yellow or white to adjust that tone a little bit, but I think it's actually really great on its own. After I have a really stiff peak on my meringue, I'm going to transfer it to a larger, wider bowl and start adding in the dry ingredients. Even though I'm making large macarons, everything about this process is exactly the same. It will be different once it comes to piping the macarons. And I do want to mention that when I make large format macarons, I oftentimes really like to use kind of a swirl, like snail shell kind of a motion and pattern, but because I want the pumpkin pie surface to look flat like a pumpkin pie would, that's why I'm going to be transferring this to a piping bag with a really, really large piping tip. I probably could have gone even bigger because I want it to just be really flat. I don't want that bumpy, rough, swirly surface. So I'm just adding in my dry ingredients and 3 additions. Once everything's incorporated, I will keep mixing, doing that macaronage to get it to the ribbon stage just like normal. So I printed off some templates just to use as a bit of a guide for piping my macaron shells. But if you don't have a printer or don't want to take the time to make these templates, just use a large circle cookie cutter or a cake tin or the rim of a bowl or anything like that that you have that is a circle. Just turn it upside down on a piece of paper, use a Sharpie or a pen just to draw around that, and voila, you have a perfect template to use. The hardest part about making such a large macaron is that it's really easy to pipe up upwards. And then once you tap your tray, you might end up with really differently sized macarons. So this can take a little bit more practice, and that's why I really like using the swirl method most of the time for large macaron shells, but this works as well. After I've got these baked, I am going to add on some royal icing details, both a white kind of whipped cream star in the center, then I'm using a petal tip to create the kind of ruffly crust on the outside. Because I was filming this for you guys, I did this and I lifted up my piping tip so I could film different angles and all of that, but I do not recommend, once you have your piping tip down, pipe the entire circle. Just go for it. You want this to be pretty stiff, and you want the wider end of that petal tip to be on the macaron shell and have the finer tip kind of pointing skyward, and then just go all the way around. As you can see here, I've got this placed on my cake turntable. I think that is really handy, so you don't have to worry about moving your hand or adjusting this on the table. So if you have a cake turntable or a cookie turntable or anything like that that rotates, absolutely I recommend using that to help you out here. After I got that on, I piped the white kind of whipped cream in the center there just with a star tip, and then I'm going to leave that to dry completely at room temperature before I start filling. I've got my completely cooled cake here. If you make it a day ahead or something, just leave it in your refrigerator or freezer overnight just to make sure that the cake isn't drying out. And then I'm using a cookie cutter. I just kind of measured how much cake I wanted on the inside based on the size of my macarons, and I'm just cutting out some circles there. The last thing I've got to do before we can fill this is make the buttercream. I'm going for a Swiss meringue buttercream today, cream cheese spiced Swiss meringue buttercream. And the reason I wanted to go for a Swiss meringue buttercream is because I wanted to incorporate some maple syrup and brown sugar in addition to the regular granulated sugar. Whenever you're using brown sugar, I think it's a lot easier to use the Swiss method. It's a lot more complicated to make an Italian meringue or an American buttercream and get that brown sugar flavor. So while I normally say yes, go ahead, adapt any of my recipes to be a different kind of buttercream, personally I think that if you want all of these flavors, probably going for the Swiss meringue buttercream is going to be the best bet. Though, of course, if you wanted to go for an Italian or American buttercream, maybe just leave out the brown sugar and go more for a maple spice vibe. Once I have the egg whites and the sugars, all of that is dissolved. It is hot to the touch. I'm transferring that to the bowl of my KitchenAid, and I'm giving that time to whip up, get really nice and fluffy, and then also cool down a bit. So what I am going to be looking for is that this meringue mixture is just slightly warmer than room temperature, and it's looking really nice and fluffy. At that point, I will start adding in first my butter that is at room temperature, like solidly at room temperature, is really nice and soft. And then I will add in the cream cheese at the very end. A lot of people will say, add in 1 tablespoon at a time or something like that, and then wait until it's fully incorporated before you start adding in the next bit. I think that's a generally good rule to follow, though I don't think you have to let it completely incorporate. I think you can wait a few seconds and then start tossing in more butter. After that butter is incorporated, I'm just going to give it a nice whip and then add in the cream cheese, and again, give it a really nice whip after that. Anytime you're working with buttercream, if you want to make sure that you kind of get a lot of that air out of it and make it really silky and smooth, you can stop using your whisk at the very end transfer that over to a paddle attachment and then just whip it on a stir or low speed for like 5 to 15 minutes and it will get really silky smooth. All right, so you've got that maple brown sugar spice cream cheese buttercream. I've got my dried royal icing decorated macaron shells, and I've got that cake all ready. Let's stack this. I'm putting a little bit of buttercream down just to make sure it doesn't slide around while I'm working on it. And then what I'm going to do is add a little bit more again, just to make sure that the cake I add on next doesn't go anywhere. Make sure to really hold it in place. Then I'm going to take my buttercream and pipe some bulbs around the outside of the cake, and I'm going to just make sure that it goes up higher than the cake so that when I stick my top shell of the macaron on top, it has something to rest on and there isn't a gap. I realized once I started piping these bulbs, wow, my cake is really pretty high for this size of a macaron. It was delicious, a delicious amount of cake, but a little bit higher than maybe I wanted. So I did shave off maybe a 0.5 centimeter for my next macarons that I did fill. But it really depends on you, how much cake you want inside, how much buttercream you want, how tall you want this to be. You can really adjust the amount of cake you put inside, and that will help you adjust how much buttercream you have as well. Then I'm just sandwiching that top shell on top. And then this, just like any macaron, will go into the refrigerator overnight to mature before you want to dig into this. I'm just going to show you one more time with a little bit smaller piece of cake this time. Honestly, it is so cute. I know that it's maybe a little bit deceptive since it looks like a pie but tastes like a cake. If you wanted to full on go with the pie vibe, you could put some sort of more pumpkin puree, compote sort of filling, maybe a pumpkin caramel. I don't know if you wanted to keep the pie vibe going, but I really loved how this turned out. Cutting into it, I wanted to get a really nice cross section. I probably should have just removed the white royal icing in the center, but I just went for it. So yeah, it is a little bit tough to like actually cut through royal icing like that, so don't mind my struggle here. Again, I should have just cut to the side or hacked it off, but I wanted it to look nice, so I just went for it. But as you can see, large format macarons, if that is something that is new to you, it is actually really wonderful. It matures just the same way your small macarons will. It needs that time in the refrigerator to come to that nice chewy texture and not be crunchy and crumbly anymore. But it will act the same way. I find that large macarons, kind of depends on the filling, but in general, I feel like they have a shorter shelf life than small macarons would. So if you are going to make this for a gathering or for a friend or for a sale, I would keep that in mind. You probably want to have a shorter time between when you're making it and when you or someone else is consuming it. I really hope you love this tutorial and the recipes below. As I mentioned earlier, you can adapt this to small format macarons or regular size macarons, or have it with this size. You can adjust this a lot of different ways, whether you want to have just this buttercream or use this for a regular cake, whether you want the royal icing design or just regular macaron shells. There are so many things you could do. If you are inspired by this video and you give it a try yourself, make sure to tag me on Instagram so I can see your end results. I love seeing what you guys come up with. Until next time, I hope you have a wonderful day. Bye!